Buongiorno, mi dispiace che non posso parlare in italiano un po' meglio, quindi penso che dovrò parlare in inglese. First of all, thank you for welcoming me. I'm happy to be with all of you here. When I was researching a book on Jesus, I came across a fascinating insight from the biblical scholar Ben Meyer. He contrasted the two approaches of John the Baptist and of Jesus. In general, he said, for John the Baptist, the approach was conversion first and community second. In other words, for John, what was required first was conversion, or in the Greek, metanoia, often translated as repentance, but more accurately, a complete change of mind and heart. After conversion came inclusion into the community. For John, you underwent a metanoia, symbolized by baptism, and then you were part of the community. So for John, conversion first, community second. For Jesus, however, the approach was the opposite. For Jesus, it was community first and conversion second. The first thing that Jesus did was, more often than not, welcome people, especially those who felt that they were on the margins in any way. Any conversion came second. We see that again and again in the Gospels. And it's an insight that can help us minister better to LGBT people. Community first, conversion second. And by the way, the conversion I'm speaking about is not conversion therapy, which tries to change people from homosexual to heterosexual. No, it's the conversion that we're all called to, every one of us. The complete change of hearts and minds contained in the word metanoia. So let's look at the story of three people who felt that they were living on the margins and think about the way that Jesus' actions towards them can help us in our ministry to LGBT people. Now again, I want to emphasize, let's see these people in the Gospels not as sinners because we're all sinners, but rather as those who felt they were living on the margins. First, let's consider the story of the Roman centurion. As you remember, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke tell the story of a Roman centurion living in the town of Capernaum, Jesus' base of ministry during his time in Galilee. It was a Jewish fishing town of about 1,500 to 2,000 people. The centurion meets Jesus, perhaps on the road, and tells him that his servant is sick. In response, Jesus offers to come to the centurion's house, a sign of public welcome in that time. So right away in this story, we see Jesus' welcome. But the centurion says that's not necessary. I too am a man with people under my authority, he tells Jesus. I say to one person, come, and he comes, and to another, go, and he goes. All you need to do is say the word, and my servant will be healed. Jesus professes amazement, saying that the centurion's faith is greater than in all of Israel. Then he heals the servant. But here is something not to overlook. The Roman centurion is a pagan. He's not Jewish. He is probably not even monotheistic. The centurion probably worships multiple gods. He is as far outside the Jewish milieu as you could imagine. The centurion is not only on the margins, he is beyond the margins. And how many LGBT people feel like that in the church? But notice how Jesus treats him. Does he say, pagan? Does he shout, sinner? Does he say, come back when you're Jewish? Not at all. He encounters him, he listens to him, he welcomes him, he has pity on him, and then he does a great service for him. This is how we are to treat people on the margins, with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, but most of all, with welcome. The second story is the story of the woman at the well, also known as the Samaritan woman. It's a very long reading from the Gospel of John. Jesus goes to a well at noontime in the heat of the day and meets a Samaritan woman. In the course of one of the longest conversations that Jesus has with anyone in the Gospels, we find out something about her. She has been married several times and is apparently living with someone who is not her husband. During their conversation, Jesus reveals his true identity to her as the living water. And she is so overjoyed that she leaves her water jug behind to tell her friends. It's something of a parallel to Peter and Andrew dropping their nets and leaving everything behind to follow Jesus. New Testament scholars say that there are two reasons why Jesus shouldn't even be talking to her. First, she's a woman. Second, she's a Samaritan, a group that was opposed to the Jews for a number of religious reasons. But again, notice how Jesus encounters someone who must have felt completely on the margins. Does he say sinner? Does he say fallen woman? Does he say Samaritan? Not at all. He listens carefully to her, he appreciates her situation, and he gives her a gift by revealing to her his identity. Again, it's a gesture of welcome to someone who would have felt totally marginalized. In fact, one reason she is at the well at noontime is that this is when other women would not have been around because of the heat. So she experiences herself as marginalized. How many LGBT people feel like that in the church today? But Jesus treats her with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. And at the end of the story, she goes into the town to proclaim what has happened to her. She is restored to the community, and she is now an apostle, someone sent out to spread the good news, thanks to Jesus' welcome. Finally, let's look at the story that I think best illustrates this idea of community first, conversion second. The Gospel of Luke tells us the wonderful story of Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus. Jesus, you may remember, is traveling through Jericho, a huge city. He's on his way to Jerusalem, near the end of his ministry, so he would have been well known. As a result, he probably had a large crowd following him. In Jericho, there is a man named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and so would also have been seen by the Jewish people as the chief sinner in the region. Why? Because he was seen as colluding with the Roman authorities. So Zacchaeus was someone who was probably on the outs with everyone, marginalized. Here, I would like you to consider Zacchaeus as a symbol for the LGBT person. Not because LGBT people are more sinful than the rest of us because we're all sinners, but because they feel so marginalized. Now, Luke's gospel describes Zacchaeus as short in stature. Zacchaeus could not see Jesus on account of the crowd. That was probably because of his size. But how often does the crowd get in the way of the LGBT person encountering Jesus? When are we part of the crowd that doesn't let LGBT people come close to God? So Zacchaeus climbs a sycamore tree because, as Luke tells us, he wanted to see who Jesus was. And this is really what the LGBT person wants, to see who Jesus is. But the crowd gets in the way. Now here comes Jesus making his way through Jericho, probably with hundreds of people clamoring for his attention. And out of all those people, whom does he decide to talk to? One of the religious authorities? One of his disciples? No, Zacchaeus. And what does he say? Does he shout, "Sinner"? Does he shout, "You terrible tax collector"? No. Zacchaeus looks in the tree and says, "Hurry down, for I must stay at your house today." It's a public sign of welcome to someone on the margins. And then comes my favorite line in the whole story. All who saw it began to grumble, which is exactly what's happening today towards LGBT people. People grumble. Just go online and you'll see all the grumbling. An offer of mercy to someone on the margins always makes people angry. But Zacchaeus climbs down from the tree, and, as the Gospels say, he stood there. But the original Greek is much stronger. Stathes. He stood his ground. He stood his ground. How often do LGBT people have to stand their ground in the face of opposition, prejudice, and hatred, even in the church? Then comes a surprise. Zacchaeus says he will give half of his possessions to the poor and repay anyone he has defrauded 4 times over. An encounter with Jesus leads to conversion, as it does for everyone. And again, what do I mean by conversion? Not conversion therapy. And probably not even leaving his profession behind, because the only tax collector in the Gospels that gives up his profession is Matthew. No, the conversion that happens to Zacchaeus is the conversion that we are all called to. In the Gospels, again, Jesus calls it metanoia, a conversion of minds and hearts. For Zacchaeus, this conversion meant giving money to the poor. All this comes from an encounter with Jesus, because again, for Jesus, it's more often than not community first, conversion second. For John the Baptist, the model was convert first and then be welcomed into the community. For Jesus, community first, conversion second. This is how Jesus treats people who feel like they're on the margins. He seeks them out before anyone else, he encounters them, and he treats them with respect, sensitivity, and compassion. So it seems to me, my friends, when it comes to LGBT people, there are 2 places to stand. You can stand with the crowd who grumbles and oppose mercy for those on the margins, or you can stand with Zacchaeus and, more importantly, with Jesus. You can stand with Jesus and welcome them into the community. Thank you very much. Grazie.